Hashtag Michigan, did you know? Thinking faced. Fort Detroit, 1701 to 1826. Established the 23rd of July 1701 as Fort Ponchartrain du Detroit by Antoine de la Mothe Cadillac as a French fort and trading post, later renamed as Fort Detroit. Also known as Fort Lernault and Fort Shelby. The fort was rebuilt, enlarged, relocated and renamed several times. The generic name Fort Detroit or just Detroit was popularly ascribed to all the incarnations, especially by people outside the immediate area. The final site was given to the city of Detroit in 1826 and destroyed in 1827. http://fortwiki.com/fort_Detroit. Fort Detroit. Fort Wiki Historic US and Canadian Forts. Early history. Built by the French officer Antoine de la Mothe Cadillac in 1701 to prevent the British from moving west and to monopolize the fur trade in the region. Originally constructed as a 200 feet square palisade with 12 feet walls and towers at each corner. In April 1712, a force of about 1,000 Fox, Sac and Mascouten Indians besieged the French garrison at Fort Detroit. The attacking Indians were then caught between the French in the fort and their Indian allies outside the fort. The attacking Indians fled to present-day Windmill Point, where they surrendered and were massacred in what is known as the Fox Indian Massacre. This incident signaled the beginning of the First Fox Indian War, 1712 to 1716. In 1716, Fox Chief Pemaussa was captured, ending the war. French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763, Fort Ponchartrain remained in French hands through most of the French and Indian War until it was occupied by the British on the 29th of November 1760. The fort was then renamed Fort Detroit by the new British garrison. Fort Detroit became the last major French fort to fall as the British gained control of North America. The 1763 Treaty of Paris ended the war, confirmed British control and defined the boundaries. Revolutionary War, 1775 to 1783. In 1778, British Captain Richard B. Lernault constructed a new fort a few hundred yards to the north of the original. It was named Fort Lernault on the 3rd of October 1779 and was later renamed Fort Detroit in 1805. It is thought that only Fort Lernault survived the 1805 fire which destroyed Detroit, and that no parts of the original Fort Detroit remained after this time. During the American Revolutionary War, the fort was used by the British to arm and support Indian raiding parties who attacked American settlements well down into what is now Kentucky. Prisoners captured by these raiding parties were often marched long distances under terrible condition to reach Fort Detroit. This practice continued until well after the end of the Revolution, and it was not until 1783 that all prisoners were released from Fort Detroit. Solomon Lytton and his family were captured by British Captain Henry Byrd and his Indian allies at John Martin's Station near Paris, Kentucky, on the 26th of June 1870 and marched 300 miles to Fort Detroit. Solomon was separated from his family, sold as a slave to an Indian named Big Fish and kept at Shawneetown near Fort Detroit. The Lytton family were all released from Fort Detroit on the 18th of July 1783 by order of British General Haldimand. The family then walked back to southern Virginia by way of New York City. The 1783 Treaty of Paris ended the Revolutionary War but did not completely settle the boundary issues between Britain and the United States. The 1793 Jay Treaty settled the remaining issues, and the fort and the surrounding settlement were surrendered to the Americans on the 11th of July 1796, 13 years after the Treaty of Paris ended the war. War of 1812 to 1814, the fort was surrendered to the British during the War of 1812 on the 15th of August 1812, and it remained in British hands until recaptured by American forces on the 29th of September 1813. Fort Lernault was then renamed Fort Shelby, after Governor Isaac Shelby of Kentucky, who had assisted in the recapture. This fort was given to the city of Detroit in 1826 and dismantled in 1827. In 1840, another perceived threat from the British in Canada caused the United States to establish a line of forts at strategic points along the Great Lakes. The old Fort Detroit was not suitable for this role, and Fort Wayne, too, was constructed as one of northern frontier forts. Current status, destroyed. Sites are a part of downtown Detroit. Location, Old Fort Detroit, south of Jefferson Street between Griswold Street and Shelby Street. Fort Lernault, Fort Shelby, intersection of Fort Saint and Shelby Street. Maps and images, lat. 42.330124 long, minus 83.048766. Black small square multi-maps from Acme, black small square maps from Bing, black small square maps from Google, black small square elevation, 600 feet, sources, black small square Roberts, Robert B., Encyclopedia of Historic Forts, the Military, Pioneer, and Trading Posts of the United States, Macmillan, New York, 1988, 10th printing, ISBN 0-02-926880X, page 417 to 418, links, Black Small Square North American Forts, Fort Detroit, Black Small Square Wikipedia, Fort Detroit, Black Small Square Wikipedia, Fort Shelby.
Rejoiced at the signing of the Treaty of Paris with Great Britain. Although the United States had already written its first constitution under the Articles of Confederation and formed a new government, the new treaty formally ended the war. It also extended America's western boundaries past the Appalachian Mountains all the way to the Mississippi River. It was the first of the many land acquisitions that added westward territory. The first expansion of the United States created an enormous opportunity, as the new western land contained endless room for settlement and resources for business. It also created an enormous challenge. The land was unmapped and largely unexplored. Many Native American tribes still claimed ownership of the land, and the French, British, and Russians were in no hurry to surrender their land or trading posts. The land north of the Ohio River Valley, that included the Great Lakes, was known as the Northwest Territory. This region in particular was important to trade, commerce, and security for the new nation. The question was, how would these territories progress towards statehood? Many of the existing states had made claims to land that extended beyond their western border. The U.S. government responded by passing the Land Ordinance of 1785 to handle the settling and governing of open land. The Land Ordinance was passed by Congress to sell the land and raise money to pay costs such as debts from the Revolutionary War. Once the land was sold, the law created a process for the surveying of the land in ranges and the creation of townships that included areas for public services such as schools. The second land law passed was the 1787 Northwest Ordinance. This law was passed to settle issues concerning the Northwest Territory, the region that made up the northwestern quarter of the United States in the 1780s. Among the things settled by the law was land ownership, which was given to the purchaser of the land and their children. In the townships organized in the Northwest, local governments were created with a governor, officials, laws, and a court system. This maintained democracy and guaranteed people the same rights and freedoms that all other citizens of the U.S. enjoyed under the Articles of Confederation. Finally, the territories set their boundaries and applied for statehood once their population reached 60,000. Ohio was the first state to be formed in 1802. States in the Northwest were also required to ban slavery. Opponents of slavery used the ordinance to prevent new northern states from gaining pro-slavery representatives in Congress. As a compromise, slave owners were given the right to capture escaped slaves.
The Spanish National Assembly ended slavery in Puerto Rico on March 22, 1873. Slave owners were given 35 million pesetas for each slave owned, and the slaves were forced to compensate their former owners for the loss of income by paying for their freedom with 3 years of labor. Freed slaves could work for their former masters, for other people, or for the state, who forwarded the wages to the former master at the end of the term. If the wages garnished during that 3-year period did not meet the price set by the ex-owner, the protector's office was to pay any difference owed to the ex-owner, or 23% of the ex-slave's estimated value, whichever was greater. The only exceptions to having their wages garnished were ex-slaves that could prove they were over 65 or under 5 years old at the time of abolition. The decree also prohibited all Afro-Puerto Ricans from having voting privileges for 5 years following abolition. There were close to 30,000 slaves freed in Puerto Rico, or about 5% of the population at the time. Emancipation Day is a national holiday in Puerto Rico that is celebrated on March 22nd to commemorate the end of slavery.